Hello, good evening and welcome, and thank you for your company for another video from me, B. Hope you're all well. This is a continuation of last week's because the Somerton Man story has developed, so I shall bring you that and some more cases, but this is Unsolved Cases Part 3. Enjoy! For decades he has only been known as a man frozen in death, a face without peace, rigid and inscrutable, with deep wells of darkness beneath his lidded eyes. Now, for the first time, the face of the mysterious Somerton Man, whose body was found laying on an Adelaide beach in 1948, has been revealed in life. Photos of Charles Webb, who was recently linked to the Somerton Man by DNA and genealogical testing, show him smiling and playing a prank on one of his relatives. Taken in the 1920s, they were found in a musty photo album, kept in a back room by the Webb family. Within its pages were the answers to questions that had gripped experts and amateur sleuths alike for 74 years. Who was the Somerton Man, and what did he look like? Until recently, the Webb family had no idea of their connection to the long-running mystery, though there were stories of a missing family member many years before. The news came from Derek Abbott of Adelaide University, who has been researching the case for many years and carried out DNA tests on a hair from the body of the Somerton Man. The finding is yet to be verified by the South Australian Police. After finding a positive match with members of the Webb family, who'd put their family tree on a genealogical website, Professor Abbott contacted Stuart Webb, who he believed was the great-grandson of the Somerton Man's brother. Professor Abbott asked me if I was related to Norman Webb, who's my grandfather, and that led to a whole series of questions about my heritage and whether there's any photos or family histories that I can recall, Stuart said. With the help of his aunt, Julie, Stuart found the photo album put together by his late grandparents. It took only 10 minutes to spot a family group photo which possibly contained an image of Charles. It showed 19 smiling faces of all ages at a fantastic family day. It looks to be somewhere rural and it looks like they're having fun, Stuart said. But he wasn't sure which of them was Charles until a week later, when he realised that two of the album's pages were stuck together. Prizing them apart, he found another family photo, on which the names had been handwritten: Grandpa, Grandma, Roy and Charlie. And I felt so elated that we'd found him. It was like being on a treasure hunt, Stuart said. Then he went back to the larger family photo and was able to identify Charles as the young man in the back row on the far right, with his hand playfully positioned above the head of the man thought to be his brother-in-law, Gerald Keane. Family members have also now identified Charles in a 1921 photo showing the Swinburne Technical College under-16 football team. They believe Charles is the player in the front row on the far left. Meanwhile, DNA tests have confirmed the link between family and Charles. Stuart's sister Christy Webb volunteered to do a saliva test and was found to be right in the middle of the range of a DNA match, according to Professor Abbott. So you are a great-great-niece of Charles Webb, he told Christy in a Zoom call. For Stuart and Christy, it was bittersweet to discover their family's connection to the case. It was happiness, it was joy, Christy said, but there was also some sadness about this forgotten family member. This was a person. He wasn't just a media hit for a little while and an unsolved mystery. He was our family. Two trainee jockeys, exercising their horses, found the body on Somerton Beach, south of Adelaide, on December the 1st, 1948. He was alone without identification, and the labels on his clothing had been ripped out. Nobody came forward to identify him. In the Cold War climate of the time, there was speculation that the man may have been a foreign spy. Over the following decades, the Somerton Man became known as one of Australia's most notorious unsolved cases, with an international following. In 2021, South Australian Police announced they would exhume the body in an effort to finally identify him through improved DNA technology. While police worked on extracting DNA from the body in cooperation with the state coroner, Professor Abbott had begun his own investigation using a 73-year-old hair from the Somerton Man's body. The hair was found embedded in a plaster death mask made from the man's face before he was buried in 1949. The professor definitely wanted to be first over the finishing line of cracking the case, said his wife, Rachel Egan, who at the time was thought to be the granddaughter of the Somerton Man. But Professor Abbott's background is in electrical engineering, not forensics. For help unlocking the mysteries of the Somerton Man's DNA, he sought help from American forensic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick, a pioneer in using online family tree data to solve cold case crimes. To their amazement, the hair yielded 2 million DNA markers, each a unique code that represents a person's characteristics. Loading the information into a genealogical website, they found as many as 4,000 potential matches, but which one was the right one? We looked for people with no date of death, Professor Abbott said. There was one that stood out because he was male. He was roughly the right age, and he was very closely connected to the Keane family, and the Somerton Man had the name Keane on his tie. That person was Charles, who'd gone off the radar after 1947. To prove or eliminate Charles as the Somerton Man, they tunnelled down the family tree on his mother's side to see if they could find somebody alive today who might supply a DNA sample. That's how they found Antero Bonifacio, who runs a store selling combustion heaters in Bairnsdale, Victoria. I got a call from Professor Abbott wanting to know if I could help with some research and do a DNA test, he recalled. It was like, hang on a minute, is this a scam? But I made sure that he was who he said he was, so I volunteered to do that. When the results came back, it was a match. Charles is Antero's first cousin, 3 times removed. I am 100% convinced that we have the right guy. Charles Webb is Somerton Man, Colleen Fitzpatrick said. South Australian police have contacted many of the same family members located by Professor Abbott, but they remain tight-lipped about progress on their own separate DNA investigation. For the living relatives of Charles who've recently discovered their link to the bizarre case, there are other puzzling questions. It's quite incredible when you look at these photos, and this guy obviously went missing and nobody came forward, Stewart says. Antero, looking at old photo albums with his own family, had the same reaction. Why didn't any of the siblings try and find out where he went? Did they know he'd gone to Adelaide and never came back? Or did he just go off and no one knew where he was? And as they learn more about the life of their long-dead relative, there are sobering reminders that this is not a story with a happy ending. Despite what some may say, I think, in all likelihood, that they've discovered who the Somerton Man was. It seems to me to be too much of a chance that he was discovered with clothing bearing the name Keane, when it was actually his brother-in-law's surname. And even though the cause of death will remain a mystery, at least he's now got a name and a face, and not just a label and a death mask. The Hammersmith Nudes Murders is the name of a series of 6 murders in West London, England, in 1964 and 65. The victims, all prostitutes, were found undressed in or near the River Thames, leading the press to nickname the killer Jack the Stripper. 2 earlier murders committed in West London in 1959 and 1963 have also been linked by some investigators to the same perpetrator. The first of the victims was Elizabeth Figg, a 21-year-old from Cheshire who'd moved down to London and settled in the Chiswick area. She'd become forced to supplement her meagre income by working occasionally as a prostitute. On the night of Tuesday the 16th of June 1959, Figg was spotted getting into a vehicle driven by a man, and she was never seen alive again. Her body was discovered on a path at Duke's Meadows, a park near the river, at dawn the following morning. She was nude from the waist down. Her dress had been ripped to expose her breasts, and marks on her neck indicated that she'd been strangled. Police were certain that the man she'd got into the car with had committed the murder, but with witnesses unable to identify the man or the car, the case soon went cold. The next victim was Welsh woman Gwyneth Rees. Rees had moved to London via Essex, where she lived with her sister. She also was forced to earn extra income through sex work. Rees's body was found in November 1963 by the river in Mortlake, just across from Duke's Meadows Park, naked but for one sock and strangled to death. Hannah Tailford was next, a 30-year-old mother of 2 who was pregnant with her 3rd child when she was murdered. She'd been missing for over a week before she was found, was naked when she was discovered, and had her underwear stuffed in her mouth. Police initially did not see her as a victim of a crime. It's not that they didn't bother to look into the case. Based on a post-mortem and a study of tide flows, they managed to work out that Tailford had entered the water 24 hours previously at Duke's Meadows Park, but they simply shrugged and called it a suicide. On the 8th of April 1964, the body of Irene Lockwood, a 26-year-old woman from Nottinghamshire, was found floating face down in the river in Chiswick. Her body was discovered naked, and she was also pregnant at the time of death. Police established that she'd been strangled, and also noted with grim foreboding the location of her death. It's at this point they realised that Hannah Tailford had not committed suicide, and that a serial killer was on the loose. They linked Lockwood's death with Tailford's and with Gwyneth Rees, but for some reason went on to omit Rees from the official list of victims. Perhaps as a result of the increased police presence along the river, the next victim was instead dumped in an alleyway in Brentford and discovered on the morning of the 24th of April 1964. She was Helen Bartholomew, a 22-year-old Scottish woman who travelled down to London eager to seek her fortune. Unfortunately, her big dreams had not quite materialised before she was forced to turn to prostitution, and they were halted completely when she was murdered. There were two significant finds on Helen Bartholomew's body. The first was her missing front teeth. This was to become a signature on the remaining strippers' victims. More importantly, police discovered tiny flecks of industrial paint on her skin. This was the first big break in the case, and detectives theorised that the killer was an industrial worker who was exposed to such flecks of paint at work, or perhaps even stored the bodies at his place of work before getting rid of them. Mary Fleming was a 30-year-old mother of four who was born in Scotland but grew up near Newcastle. She'd turned to prostitution when her marriage fell apart, and her body was discovered on a residential street in Chiswick on the morning of the 14th of July 1964. Her front teeth were missing and she'd been strangled, and her body was found unclothed. Several residents said they'd heard a car reverse and then speed off overnight, and the telltale paint specks were found on Fleming's skin. The stripper's fifth victim, discovered at the end of November 1964, was different. Although she was discovered strangled, naked, and missing front teeth like the others, and her skin was covered in paint specks like the others, she was discovered in High Street, Kensington, still in West London, but in another world to the killer's industrial suburban stomping ground. This was a fashionable part of London that was enjoying the swinging 60s, and the victim's identity was in keeping with that. She was Margaret McGowan, another Scottish woman who was working as a prostitute, under the alias of Frances Brown, but at the higher end of the trade. The 21-year-old's clients included businessmen and politicians, and she had testified with Christine Keeler and Mandy Rice Davis at Stephen Ward's trial in the midst of the infamous Profumo scandal. She had last been seen by a friend as she climbed into a client's car in October, and when her body was found a month later, the friend was able to tell the police what kind of car it was, a grey Ford Zephyr, and give a rough description of the man. It was the biggest break in the case yet, but it would still not lead to the killer's capture. The final victim was discovered in February 1965 on the Heron Industrial Trading Estate in Ealing. Bridget O'Hara, also known as Bridie, was a 28-year-old Irish immigrant who, like most of the victims, struggled to find her place in London and had to turn to sex work to support herself. She'd been missing since the 11th of January until an electrician discovered her body at dawn on the 16th of February. This confirmed to the police their suspicion that the killer stored his victims' bodies before disposing of them. London's Metropolitan Police had made some progress in the pursuit of their killer, but their search was ultimately proving fruitless. After the discovery of Bridget O'Hara, Scotland Yard recalled one of its top detectives, John Durose, from holiday to lead the investigation. Nicknamed 5-Day Johnny for his apparent ability to solve a case within 5 days, Durose mobilised hundreds of officers and had them interview practically every industrial worker in West London, including all 7,000 workers on the Heron Industrial Estate. He also ordered plainclothes officers to patrol the main roads leading in and out of central London at night, recording licence plates and making note of any cars they saw on multiple occasions. Duros settled on the theory that the suspect was a small man, hence his targeting of smaller women, whose job exposed him to spray paint and who perhaps worked at night and had knowledge of a secure lockup. The investigation was intensifying, and sure enough, O'Hara's body would lead police to another key discovery. She exhibited all the signs of a stripper victim, but her skin was burnt and slightly mummified, indicating her corpse had been stored somewhere warm. Just a few yards away from where the body was discovered, police found a lockup that had a transformer, which could have been what kept the body warm. Opposite the lockup was a spray paint shop, and the paint from that shop was found to match the paint on O'Hara and the other victims. The police had found the killer's storage space. John Duros excitedly called a press conference in which he somewhat truthfully suggested his force was close to catching the killer and, completely falsely, claimed to have narrowed the list of suspects down to 20 men. But an arrest would never be made. Just like that, the killings stopped and the police quietly shelved the case without ever solving it. One of the reasons the police shelved the case was that their prime suspect committed suicide. Mungo Ireland was a middle-aged Scot who worked as a security guard on the Heron trading estate and had access to the killer's lockup. In a 1970 interview, John Duros hinted that the killings had been committed by a married father he could only identify as Big John. Ireland, who already knew the police were watching him, took this as a sign that he was about to be arrested. Soon after, he killed himself, leaving a note for his wife explaining that he couldn't stick it any longer. Could Ireland have been the killer? The police certainly thought so, and unofficially considered the case closed once he died. He certainly did have access to the storage unit identified as the place where the bodies were kept, and his regular night shifts would have afforded him the opportunity to take the bodies there without being seen. But according to Jane Lawrenson in the Chiswick Herald, recent research has suggested that Ireland was back in his native Scotland when several of the murders occurred. In April 1964, 57-year-old Kenneth Archibald strolled into a police station in Notting Hill and voluntarily confessed to the murder of Irene Lockwood. Police were stunned and couldn't believe their luck, but immediately began to doubt Archibald's story. For a start, there was no evidence that he'd been anywhere near the scenes of the crimes, nor that he had any idea where the murder locations were. His story was inconsistent, and though he stood trial in June 1964, he was quickly found not guilty. It seems that Archibald wasn't in full command of his faculties when he made his original confession. Freddie Mills was a boxing champion who was involved in organised crime. What is interesting about him is that most London gangsters of the time, including the notorious Cray twins, were convinced he was the murderer. He was killed in July 1965, which is the same year the killings stopped, but there's not much more evidence to support the theory. Besides, if the killer was thought to have been diminutive, then a 5'11" boxing champion probably wasn't your man. Some of the top detectives in the investigation suspected that the killer was one of their own, that he had to have some sort of inside knowledge that kept him safe from capture. This could explain why he was able to evade the increased police patrols, especially by the river. Again, there is not much evidence to support this. This is where it gets interesting. Harold Jones, who also went by the names Harry Jones and Harry Stevens, was seemingly a quiet man from Abertille, South Wales. He moved to London in the 1940s and lived an anonymous life with his wife and daughter at several addresses in the Hammersmith area throughout the 1960s. But he is a tempting suspect because there was a reason he went by different names and because there was a reason he had left South Wales. In his hometown of Abertille, Harold Jones was anything but anonymous. In 1921, a 15-year-old Jones was convicted of the brutal murders of 2 young girls in the small mining town. The details of his crimes are chilling. He lured 8-year-old Frida Burnell to the back of his family's shop, strangled her and dumped her body in a nearby street. He was arrested for this but acquitted due to a lack of evidence. Upon his acquittal, he was welcomed back to Abertillery like a hero. Townspeople were convinced that he'd been set up by the London detectives who had been sent to assist the investigation. One man who welcomed him heartily was George Little, a next-door neighbour and close friend of the Jones family. Just days later, Harold Jones lured George's 11-year-old daughter Florence Little into his home and murdered her too. Her body was discovered in the Jones family attic, and it was young Harold's father who furiously chased his son through the streets and apprehended him. His tender age saved him from the hangman's noose, and he instead served 20 years in prison for both murders. When he was released in 1941, he often returned to his parents' home in Abertillery, and even made sure he was seen visiting his victims' graves. A show of remorse? Or perhaps something more creepy, even sinister? Regardless, the folk of Abertillery were not too keen on him being back in the area, and Jones decided to start afresh in London, where he eventually married and became a father. His past crimes alone are not enough to say for certain that he was Jack the Stripper, but there is circumstantial evidence. Firstly, there is the fact that he was a proven killer who had strangled someone to death before. He had actually slit the throat of poor Florence Little, and had a habit of storing bodies before getting rid of them. What is also consistent is the choice of victim, small vulnerable people who the diminutive Jones could overpower. He is known to have lived very close to the area where the Hammersmith murders occurred. He even lived within 4 streets of both Hannah Tailford and Bridget O'Hara, and the murders stopped around the same time Jones was struck down by bone cancer, from which he would die in 1971. Perhaps most striking of all, Jones was known to have been employed as a metal worker and caretaker on the Heron Industrial Estate in Ealing. It is almost certain by now that the killer is no longer alive, their secret taken to the grave. The Hammersmith victims are not widely known, but their memory should not be forgotten. The brothers of a man who disappeared from a North Sea ferry 40 years ago said they always suspected it to be a foul play or murder case. Kevin Dundon from Essex was aged 22 when he went missing while on a vessel returning to Felixstowe from Zeebrugge in Belgium on the 21st of September 1980. As of 2020, Suffolk Police are reviewing the case and said there was growing support his disappearance was not accidental. Kevin was one of 5 children from an Irish family who lived in Clacton-on-Sea. He'd been close to his 3 brothers, Jimmy, Tom and Danny, and their sister Jennifer. Kevin had stayed with his brother Tom in Ipswich the night before he went to work on the Viking Viscount. Tom, who was 23 at the time, said he never expected not to see his brother again when he dropped him off at Felixstowe ahead of that fateful trip. It didn't seem real, he said. We were all in shock, in disbelief. Kevin was employed by shipping company Townsend Torreson and had been working on the vessel for 3 days when he disappeared. His duties included washing crockery in the galley. Witness statements from colleagues said he was working in the plate room at about 1800 BST that Sunday, and the last confirmed sighting of him was 30 minutes later, when he was believed to have been exiting the galley through a door which could have taken him to either the toilets or the deck. When he wasn't working, all of them would nip into the ship's bar for a drink, said Tom. There were lots of crew and a few passengers in that ship's bar, and they were having drinks and laughs. Kevin was going back to work and then coming back in again, and having a drink maybe, and going back to work, and then suddenly he went missing. Whilst now we have more detailed information and the police have more detailed information, we are looking for the final piece of the jigsaw. Tom said he received a phone call in the early hours of the Monday from a priest at Felixstowe who told him that immediately after the ship had docked, a crew member went to talk to him about what happened on the boat. The padre said to me that he couldn't tell me what he said, but don't let it drop. Bad things had happened on the boat, said Tom. In the early days of the investigation, the 3 brothers said they felt frustrated as police were leading the family to believe it was a missing persons inquiry. But for Jimmy, Tom and Danny, they never believed their brother, who they described as enjoying life, would just disappear. He was not that type of person, and none of us thought he was missing, We all thought something bad had happened and we weren't going to see him again," said Danny. Their mum Rita also told the press at the time there's no way he would have taken his life or disappeared. Jimmy, Tom and Danny, now aged 65, 63 and 60 respectively, remember Kevin as being chilled out, with a great sense of humour, and someone who would make friends easily. They said he loved music, buying clothes and taking lots of photos with his Polaroid camera. He would go out for a drink with them and was dating a local Clacton girl at the time, they said. Their mum and dad fell to pieces after his disappearance, and both they and Jennifer died without knowing what really happened. The trio described the early investigation as a calamity of errors. However, they said Suffolk Police had done a tremendous job over the last 2 years when it was picked up by the Cold Case Review team. They said their DNA had been taken and police had re-interviewed just about everybody and interviewed some people who may not have been seen the first time round. Tom said, "We are 100% certain that there's at least one person, maybe one family, who knows what happened, and we would appeal to them to help our family to have some closure on it." Kev was mine and Jimmy's little brother and one of Danny's older brothers. We've never been able to have a funeral. We've never been able to actually put it to bed. We want closure for our brother. Suffolk Police continues to appeal for fresh information. Whatever happened to Kevin, somebody out there must know. And that's it for another week. Thank you again for your company. I hope you've enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it and finding out about stuff that I'd not actually heard about before, so that was good. Anyway, don't forget to like, share, subscribe and comment on this video. And I shall see you all next week. Take care until then. Stay happy, stay healthy, stay in the good books, and don't forget, stay spooky.